With us on the podcast today is Brad Staats. He wrote the book Never Stop Learning, Stay Relevant, Reinvent Yourself, and Thrive. If you're watching the video, this is what the book looks like. It's an excellent book. Brad is a professor of operations at University of North Carolina's Keenan Flagler Business School. And I'm delighted, Brad, to have you on the show. Welcome to the Bregman Leadership Podcast.
Thanks, Peter. Excited to get to talk with you today.
So, Brad, it kind of seems obvious, but maybe spend a minute telling us why it's important more now than ever to never stop learning.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I think we have to recognize we're at a unique point in history, that there are a number of forces that are really increasing the rate at which knowledge is changing around us. And so if we're going to succeed in this new environment, then it means we have to learn continuously. How do we do our existing tasks better? How do we do entirely new things? We can think about, artificial intelligence and the rise of data as a big part of the story, right? We have an ability just to process massive amounts of information, and we see the change that goes with that. In addition, and kind of contributing to that is just the general trend of specialization, faster and faster and faster. And so as we get deeper, the struggle is, not only do we have to get down there into the depths and so learn, but then we have to be able to pull back and connect it all together. Finally, I'd highlight just the global world that we live in, right? This kind of rate of change has continued for a number of years now. And so you're not just competing with your neighbor, you're competing with the person on the opposite side of the world. All that means, right, is we're really in a learning economy, not a knowledge economy.
And are you finding that that's as true about the way we relate human being to human being and communication and these things that people would call soft skills, as much as, AI and new technologies that are coming out and new ways of operating in business?
Yeah, I think so. So I think what's interesting is, these things are converging more and more, right? So it's not just a matter of, hey, I need to learn some skills about machine learning. But importantly, then I have to bring it together. I spend a lot of time working with organizations, not, only getting into the code of machine learning, but how do you get the data science team to work with the business domain expert? And so those sorts of soft skill challenges, are constantly a struggle that we learn a new technology, but the hard is the easy typically, right? It's the, how do we actually, change our fundamental processes to take advantage of this?
So you say that we're bad at learning. Why? I would think that given how much we have to learn in school and like our very existence is dependent on our ability to learn,
Yep.
why are we so bad at it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that what my own research has shown is, as you're highlighting it, that oftentimes the biggest challenge we have for learning is ourselves, right? That the problem is us, and I think it's that many of our tendencies are really designed for speed, are designed for efficiency, and learning is often an inherently wasteful process. We have to be willing to try something new that may not work, right? That blows up in our face, that makes us look foolish. And our survival instincts teach us not to do that, right? Unfortunately, in all too many classrooms, you learn if you're not 100% sure of the answer, you don't raise your hand, right? You actually sit there quietly. And that transfers out into the business world. We get, afraid to take risks, or we're focused very much on the outcome rather than the process that gets us there. And those choices kind of compromise our ability to learn, unfortunately.
It's so interesting, Brad, because like I totally hear you and I see it. And the challenge in part is that we're rewarded for our outcomes and not for the process. We're paid based
Yep.
on outcomes and not process. People, appreciate us based on outcome and not process. So I'm just curious to get your perspective on that, or how we shift that, or how we can
Mhm.
operate where we focus. Because you talk a lot in the book about focusing on process, and you learn
Yep.
from process, and I agree with it inherently. And I love learning, and yet I can see how outcome driven I can be because I know that I can learn a ton, but if I don't get an article actually written and on HBR's website or in a
Yep.
book, then it's all well and good, but I haven't achieved anything.
No, it's a great point. I think there are a couple of observations I'd make. One is, many of our management practices, really still stem from, the Industrial Revolution, scientific management, right? And so we have things in place where we knew what the right answer was. We were trying to shovel coal and move it from one side of the yard to the other, and so we could define that really well. And so experimentation looks fundamentally different there. You can see, did you get the coal, and move it. And we take that same mindset to today, where in writing an article, I'm sure if you submitted your first article every time, bad things would happen, right? We know there's a creative process. You have to try it.
Right.
It works. Your editor responds. I think what we see organizationally is folks changing how they look at it. They know that, yes, we have to get, eventually good products, good services, but as we work, as we give feedback, it has to be all throughout the process. And so I would highlight, organizations like a Deloitte, organizations like Adobe, who fundamentally changed how they evaluate folks, that it's no longer that once a year, end of year, kind of heavyweight, tons of hours going into it, but instead every week, every other week, having quick conversations, talking about what's going on. Because I think, perversely, if we follow a good process, the outcomes follow. So it's not that, hey, outcomes are completely irrelevant, but we have to, get into those steps that move us in the right direction.
What have you found helps stoke people's curiosity over their knowing?
Oh, that's a great question. I think a lot of it has to do with tapping into what people innately care about. So these days, you hear a lot of discussions around strengths, right? And I think this is a great point that part of why they are so valuable is that they're motivational by themselves, right? And so if you can think about, if you're a manager, if you're a leader, you're working with your team, trying to understand what do people innately care about, because that certainly can draw them out in a powerful direction. But that's not the only way to do it. I think that we see good leaders are able to take advantage of purpose, right? They're able to explain, hey, what we're trying to accomplish here, and getting into that why often will spark that same curiosity as well.
It's interesting because I imagine, you mentioned leaders, and I imagine one of the most important things that leaders can do if they want to encourage the curiosity over knowing is to really create a safe environment where failure is fine and
Yep.
where people can ask questions and not know, and where progress, for some period of time might be slowed as you're moving through the discovery process. Well, I'm curious if you've had experience in seeing or helping leaders create those kinds of environments.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you hit on a number of the key points. Again, fundamental to all of this, there's a little bit of a performance paradox that if we want to succeed in the long run, it often means go slow to go fast, right?
Right.
And so be willing to learn. I think the behaviors that I see leaders do are some of the ones you mentioned. Being willing to accept failure. I love the story of Pal's Sudden Service. They're a small fast food chain in eastern Tennessee into Virginia. They've won the Malcolm Baldrige Award, so they're incredibly efficient, incredibly accomplished. But their CEO loves to get out in front of people and say, hey, look, if it's not illegal, immoral, or unethical, you're allowed to make any mistake once. Just make sure the next mistake is something new. He models, that to the entire organization, where they're a very high assurance organization. He expects them to accomplish amazing things, but he knows they're going to make mistakes, right? It's his job to prepare them. And when he makes a mistake, not only does he encourage, others to do it, he shares it. He explains, he made a really big one time. Afterwards, he came out and said, look, this cost us $500,000. I spent over $6 million on my education now, but we would not be where we are today if I hadn't done that. And so I think that sort of leadership behavior, as you made the point of creating that safe environment, modeling what you want others to do.
You talk about reflection and relaxation,
Yep.
right? And yet the problem, I think, is that most people, and we're sort of talking about this in one form or other, is they're starved for time,
Yep.
right? And so it's not even necessarily the drive for outcomes, but it's a drive for efficiency, which you mentioned earlier.
Yep.
And the starvation for time leads them to reflect and relax less. So how do we get people over the hump of the time issue?
No, I think it's a great point. I mean, I think part of it is stepping back and thinking about, to your point, efficiency, productivity, right? And there's, it's a function of both the time you put in, but also kind of the quality of the work that you're accomplishing. And so we tend to think the more work we have to do, well, I'm going to keep the quality constant, so I'll just jump up the number of hours and I get more done. Unfortunately, what we see is that reflection, that break to recharge. Yes, you lose a little bit of time, but on the other side, you gain a whole lot of quality. So let's take reflection as an example. If you study learning, what's interesting, you see, yes, we learn by doing. We learn by trying stuff out. But we also learn by thinking. And different parts of the brain get activated, whether we're doing or whether we're thinking. And so it's the combination of the two that actually maximizes our learning, actually maximizes kind of our rate of performance. And so that small time of stepping back can have a tremendous benefit. We did a really small experiment with a technology services firm. They had a 6-week training program. We took 2 weeks in the middle of the program, and we randomly assigned participants to either reflect for 15 minutes at the end of the day or continue with their same kind of 8-9 hour training program. That group that reflected, we just asked them, hey, write about 2 things you learned today. That's it, 2 things you learned. The end of the 6 weeks, they took an exam to basically qualify for the job. The group that reflected performed 25% higher. Their first month on the job, they performed 10% higher. We've done a bunch of laboratory experiments that replicate the same effect over and over again. And so I think part of it is changing our mindset, realizing this slow down to speed up later is incredibly important.
This is going to sound like the strangest question, which may just feel obvious to you, but as you know, as a workaholic, I feel like I can ask the
Yeah.
question: how do you relax? Right. I was
Yeah.
very moved, by the way. I was very moved by your rest and relaxation chapter. And I struggle with it myself. I try to be too productive. And I know it's really important to stop working and sleep more. And yet, the work doesn't really stop. And
Nope.
and I'm actually, I'll sort of reveal something else, which I revealed to you earlier, which is like I got, apparently there's absolutely no connection, but I got the shingles vaccine shot and then I got the shingles. And everybody tells me it's a dead virus, so I didn't get the shingles from the shot, but apparently I've been run down.
Right.
And I think everyone's saying you have to relax, and I'm thinking because I love learning, I'm really focused on it, but I think this relaxation thing is eluding me.
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of it comes down to the person, right? And ironically, taking some time to reflect on relaxation, figuring out for you, what's going to create that time. And different people relax at different rhythms. For some people, it's definitely a daily thing. It's part of their run that does it for them, or they're walking the dog in the morning. Other people find they need to kind of have a sprint and then take a small little vacation or take some time to step back. If I look at my own life, and I talk a little bit about this in the book, when I was in my doctoral program, we had young kids. We'd go to Disney. It was great. The kids could run around and do whatever they wanted. As an adult, you didn't have the same pressure, and it actually was an escape. Now, as I have 14, 12, and 10-year-old kids, that sounds miserable. I don't want to go do that with them. So we like active outdoor activities, and those create the break. And I think part of it, and my hunch is this might be true for you too, is giving yourself permission to relax. I'm in the same boat as you, that there's always another thing that needs done. And so, for myself, what's been the calming influence is said, look, I really will get more done if I take these 3 days, I disconnect, I leave the laptop at home, I do my best to leave the phone, and come back fully refreshed. And I think what people find is when they're able to do that, they actually start to see the benefits from it on the other side. And so that helps with kind of the analytical side of the brain, convincing ourselves.
What did your son hitting into a double play teach you about outcome bias?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think this goes back to our process discussion from earlier. So I'm fortunate enough to get to coach all of my kids. And this was my eldest. We were playing a game against a very good team. The pitcher was kind of either walking people or striking them out. And he managed to hit a ball as hard as he could. Unfortunately, it took one bounce. Shortstop grabbed it, turned a double play, and the inning was over. And he comes off, and I'm trying to congratulate him, and he wants nothing to do with that. His comment was, Dad, even a weak ground ball would have scored a run. There was only one out, and I cost across the team. And I think it highlighted this point you mentioned of outcome bias, that we think when a good outcome happens, it means we followed a good process. And when a bad outcome happens, we followed a bad process. And unfortunately, life's not that simple, right? It's not, hey, follow these 4 steps and always good stuff happens. Don't follow them and always bad stuff. Sometimes, it works out the opposite direction. I've got a friend, Cade Massey, who likes to say, look, if the world understood variance even a little bit, we'd be a much better place. And so from a learning standpoint, we have to be willing to step back and look at the process, right? What are we actually doing to try to connect us from A to B?
A lot of what you're saying in this conversation is bringing to mind Warren Buffett and other leaders that I know who are very, very good at doing 2 things. One is separating signal from noise.
Yep.
And the other is really sticking to a process, right? And the way Warren Buffett does it is very simple, right? He's like, you're going to, and the way a lot of statisticians do, which is you evaluate a set of, offer a set of percentage chances of things, and then you invest based on the percentage chances. And,
yep.
Generally, if it's 80%, if you're making a number of bets on an 80% probability, you'll be right 80% of the time. And,
Yep.
like you just do the math, which is sort of what you're saying, right? Which is focus
Absolutely.
on the process and make sure that the process leads eventually to the outcome. And if it's an 80% probability, you'll be wrong 20% of the time. And that's called failure.
Yep.
But overall, the process is useful. And then the signal to noise, which is, I remember reading an article once about Buffett, and it said, and he was quoted as saying, this is the he's made billions and billions of dollars, and he said, I probably make about 6 decisions a year, right? and I think he's thinking and he's reflecting and he's looking and then he makes a big move here and there.
Yep.
And I wonder if you've looked at any of this kind of signal for noise methodology, or I don't even know to call it methodology, but the people who are good at it, and what it takes to, to kind of really see through all of the noise, to know I'm gonna not run away with wasting a ton of time over here in this area, but I'm gonna really focus on these 2 areas, and I'm gonna make these 3 decisions that are gonna make the biggest difference.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple things you're highlighting in there. I mean, one of it is getting comfortable with, with variance, with probabilities, and knowing that, even if you have a 60-40 decision, that is that in general is going to be a great decision, right? You're gonna win far more often than you're going to lose. Unfortunately, many organizations, you're only allowed to make the 100% decision, and so think about kind of all the waste there.
Or you make that 60-40 decision, and you're allowed to make it once, and if it's
Yes.
the 40% chance, then you're no longer allowed to make decisions.
Time to move on, right? And back to kind of the organizational point, people learn, and so then they're not going to take those sorts of risks again.
You're saying that's the right risk to take. 40% of the time you're going to be wrong. That's
Absolutely.
actually batting pretty well, and you want to actually keep taking that risk.
You would, and I think, I mean, somebody like Buffett in investments, would feel good about that. Having talked to lots of folks kind of in the hedge fund space and the finance space, they're dealing with very small percentages. The 60-40, they take that and just keep doing it over and over again, right?
Right.
I think part of it is being methodical about the process. One of the great tips that I have in terms of dealing with that is writing down your expectations beforehand. Writing down why you think it's going to occur. Then, afterwards, the problem is we tend to make sense of reality based on what we expected to see, right? And so, kind of this problem of we see what we want to believe. And so if we're able to write down before, then once something happens, we can try to look back and, did it fit? Did it not fit? Why didn't it work? What can I learn from that? And how can I move on? And I think that's what the kind of Buffetts of the world really get, that fundamentally they're creating a model of how the world works. Sometimes it's got numbers behind it. Sometimes it's just up here as a middle model, but they're being really thoughtful and methodical about that.
What's failing fast and why are we so bad at it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it gets back to some of the themes that we've had in this discussion. So before I went back to academia, I'd spent time in venture capital, and around the startup world, this idea of try something new, see if it works, fail or succeed, but either way, speed, right? Fast, fast, fast. And so this idea of kind of ready, fire, aim,
Right.
that you try it and you move on. And I think while that's a mantra in lots of organizations, I rarely see an organization that when I actually talk to people and they're honest with me doesn't say, yeah, we really struggle with this. We
Right.
have the bumper sticker, but we're not able to do it. And,
Right.
and I think it gets back to your point, from earlier about that 60-40 example that, what happens is somebody, has the 60-40 decision, they get on the 40 side and suddenly that promising career gets derailed,
Right.
right? Instead of seeing, hey, we had to try it, it didn't work, now we move on. It's, hey, now you're off the fast track. Now, kind of go back to some grudge work or whatever it is. We kind of we have learned helplessness setting in. And so, thinking about, especially for leaders, of what can we do to encourage people? Part of it is being willing to share your own failures. When I teach groups of mid-level leaders, I love to have the senior folks come in and ask them, hey, talk about when you failed. And for many people, this is the first time they're hearing it in the organization. They just assume if you got to that level, here's the narrative of everything that worked. But instead, they're making it okay to fail.
Right.
Another thing you can do as a leader, is actually track failure rate and encourage people that, if our success rate is too high, it means we're not trying enough things. It means we're not innovating enough. And look, I mean, if you're running a nuclear reactor, by all means, don't have a high failure rate, right? But if we're in a standard role that needs innovation and everything we try is successful, that doesn't mean you're really good. That means you're not pushing the boundaries nearly far enough.
You talk about if you make that 40% decision and it fails, and then everybody looks at you, or you're not given the choice to or the right to make another decision.
Yep.
I also think that's self-imposed, meaning we make a
Yes.
decision, it fails, and we begin to question our own competence. And there's this great term in football that I remember reading about called PACE, which is performance after critical error. And they found that the most successful quarterbacks um, had a high performance after critical error, meaning they made a mistake
Yep.
and the next play wasn't infected by that mistake. I'm curious what you have learned about increasing our pace, right? Increasing our ability to perform after we've made mistakes.
No, it's a really important point. I mean, I think there are a couple of pieces there. I mean, one is the confidence to press on, and so in that quarterback example, that they don't kind of get overwhelmed by the fear of failure, and so part of addressing that is normalizing or destigmatizing failure, helping people see that this is going to happen, this is part of the role, and we just have to press on. And so with a quarterback, that there are going to be interceptions. No one is going to go an entire season without an interception. I think the second piece, though, is making sure we learn from the failure. That unfortunately, many times because we're so embarrassed by it, we sort of try to cover our eyes, like the 2-year-old, and nothing to see here, move along. Those really good quarterbacks, you see them on the sidelines. They're looking at what happened. They see the middle linebacker jumped out, right, and kind of stole the pass. In the same way as a leader, we need to be willing to look at what happened. We've done some work looking at attribution. After an event occurs, do you blame yourself or the situation? And unfortunately, many times when we fail, we engage in what's called the fundamental attribution error. That's when it's us, we blame the situation and don't really take responsibility, right? Oh, it wasn't me. No one could have been successful here, right? I was just incredibly unlucky.
Right.
And unfortunately, that we pass up the opportunity to learn then. So we did a study looking at cardiac surgeons, and in their case, failure was losing a patient. And unfortunately, sometimes you operate on a very sick patient. You're not gonna save them all. And what we saw is they actually did not learn from their own failures. They did not improve from their own failures, likely because of this attribution problem. Interestingly, they would learn from others, because for other people, you're likely to blame the person, not the situation.
Oh, so interesting.
And so, what I think is incredibly important, whether you're a quarterback, whether you're a leader, that when something goes wrong, you ask yourself, hey, how was I responsible? Not in a way of now I'm paralyzed to try again, but what can I learn? How can I use this to increase my likelihood of success next time?
It's really, really interesting, that point that we learn from other people's errors much more effectively than we learn from our own errors.
Yep. Yeah, and I think it is just part of a general theme of incorporating other people in our learning journey. That, I've gotten better at this with time. I didn't start in a good place here. Of when you make a mistake, you want to kind of hide, right? You don't want to tell anybody or share it. And now when I make mistakes, trying to go out, hey, what went wrong here? Why did this go wrong? How can I do better? In teaching is a great example. Every so often a class just won't go right. And so in the past, would almost want to kind of bury my head and not, talk to anybody, but instead, whether it's going to other faculty, here's a plan that didn't work, whether it's actually talking to the students, hey, clearly something was off today. Let's understand what it was. And that openness creates an environment where then everyone can learn, not only you.
Do you have an example of having done that recently?
I can think of an older one that was an example around teaching a Teams class. And it was interesting. I thought I had great content. I'd prepped this all and delivered it, and just fell totally flat. And my first reaction as I'm driving home is, okay, I'm going to pretend that never happened. It wasn't me. They didn't want to be there. And the more I thought about it, was, okay, I might need to practice what I preach here. And so I actually turned to another faculty and brought in my materials. And it was fascinating that then when somebody else could step in, he pointed out kind of my key problem was in my excitement to teach them. I had taught them, they were drinking from a fire hose. There was concept after concept after concept.
Right.
And so I'd given them a lot of great stuff, but they had no hope of actually learning it. And so it was a great lesson to me of paring back, right? A theme of our conversation today. Sometimes less is more. And it was certainly true with respect to that learning opportunity.
This is great. Brad, I've so enjoyed this conversation. There's a lot of personal lessons for me about slowing down also. The book is Never Stop Learning, Stay Relevant, Reinvent Yourself, and Thrive. It's as delightful as this conversation was. Brad, thank you so much for being on the Bregman Leadership Podcast.
Absolutely. Thanks, Peter. I hope you feel better.